What shall we say of the democratic trend of the modern world as it affects the finer sort of intellectual achievement? While the conscious sway of the masses seems not uncongenial to the more popular and obvious kinds of eminence, as of statesmen, inventors, soldiers, financiers, and the like, there are many who believe it to be hostile to distinction in literature, art, or science. Is there hope for this also, or must we be content to offset the dearth of greatness by the abundance of mediocrity? This, I take it, is a matter for a priori psychological reasoning, rather than for close induction from fact. The present democratic movement is so different from anything in the past that historical comparison of any large sort is nearly or quite worthless. And, moreover, it is so bound up with other conditions which are not essential to it, and may well prove transient that even contemporary fact gives us very little secure guidance. All that is really practicable is a survey of the broad principles at work and a rough attempt to forecast how they may work out. An inquiry of this sort seems to me to lead to conclusions somewhat as follows. First, there is, I believe, no sound reason for thinking that the democratic spirit or organization is in its essential nature hostile to distinguished production. Indeed, one who holds that the opposite is the case, while he will not be able to silence the pessimist, will find little in fact or theory to shake his own faith. Second, although democracy itself is not hostile, so far as we can make out its nature by general reasoning, there is much that is so in the present state of thought, both in the world at large and, more particularly, in the United States. In this, as in all discussions regarding contemporary tendency, we need to discriminate between democracy and transition. At present, the two go together because democracy is new, but there is no reason in the nature of things why they should remain together. As popular rule becomes established, it proves capable of developing a stability, even a rigidity of its own. And it is already apparent that the United States, for instance, just because democracy has had its way there, is less liable to sudden transitions than perhaps any other of the great nations. It is true that democracy involves some elements of permanent unrest. Thus, by demanding open opportunity and resisting hereditary stratification, it will probably maintain a competition of persons more general, and, as regards personal status, more unsettling than anything the world has been used to in the past. But personal competition alone is the cause of only a small part of the stress and disorder of our time, much more being due to general changes in the social system, particularly in industry, which we may describe as transition. Moreover, competition itself is in a especially disordered or transitional state at present, and will be less disquieting when a more settled state of society permits it to be carried on under established rules of justice, and when a discriminating education shall do a large part of its work. In short, democracy is not necessarily confusion, and we shall find reason to think that it is the latter, chiefly, that is opposed to distinction. The view that popular rule is in its nature unsuited to foster genius rests chiefly on the dead level theory. Equality, not distinction, is said to be the passion of the masses, diffusion, not concentration. Everything moves on a vaster and vaster scale. The facility of intercourse is melting the world into one fluid whole, in which the single individual is more and more submerged. The era of salient personalities is passing away, and the principle of equality, which ensures the elevation of men in general, is fatal to particular greatness. In modern society, said de Tocqueville, the chief begetter of this doctrine, everything threatens to become so much alike that the peculiar characteristics of each individual will soon be entirely lost in the general aspect of the world. Shall we agree with this, or maintain with Plato that a democracy will have the greatest variety of human nature? Perhaps the most plausible basis for this theory is the leveling effect ascribed by many to the facilities for communication that have grown up so surprisingly within the past century. In a former chapter, I have said much upon this matter, holding that we must distinguish between the individuality of choice and that of isolation, and giving reasons why the modern facility of intercourse should be favorable to the former. To this we may add that the mere fact of popular rule has no inevitable connection, either friendly or hostile, with variety and vigor of individuality. If France is somewhat lacking in these, it is not because she is democratic, but because of the race traits of her people and her peculiar antecedents. If America abounds in a certain kind of individuality, it is chiefly because she inherited it from England and developed it in a frontier life. In either case, democracy, in the sense of popular government, is a secondary matter. Certainly, America is a rather convincing proof that democracy does not necessarily suppress salient personality. So far as individuality of spirit is concerned, our life leaves little to be desired, and no trait impresses itself more than this upon observers from the continent of Europe. Nowhere else, not even in England, I suppose, is there more respect for nonconformity or more disposition to assert it. In our intensely competitive life, men learn to value character above similarity, and one who has character may hold what opinions he pleases. Personality, as Mr. Brownell points out in contrasting the Americans with the French, is the one thing of universal interest here. Our conversation, our newspapers, our elections are dominated by it, and our great commercial transactions are largely a struggle for supremacy among rival leaders. The augmenting numbers of the people, far from obscuring the salient individual, only make for him a larger theater of success. And personal reputation, whether for wealth, statesmanship, literary achievement, or for mere singularity, is organized on a greater scale than ever before. One who is familiar with any province of American life, as for example that of charitable and penal reform, is aware that almost every advance is made through the embodiment of timely ideas in one or a few energetic individuals who set an example for the country to follow. Experience with numbers, instead of showing the insignificance of the individual, proves that if he has faith and a worthy aim, there is no limit to what he may do. And we find, accordingly, plenty of courage in starting new projects. The country is full of men who find the joys of self-assertion, if not always of outward success in the bold pursuit of hazardous enterprises. If there is a deficiency of literary and artistic achievement in a democracy of this kind, it is due to some other cause than a general submergence of the individual in the mass. The enlargement of social consciousness does not alter the essential relation of individuality to life, but simply gives it a greater field of success or failure. The man of genius may meet with more competition, but if he is truly great, a larger world is his. To imagine that the mass will submerge the individual is to suppose that one aspect of society will stand still while the other grows. It rests upon a superficial, numerical way of thinking, which regards individuals as fixed units, each of which must become less conspicuous the more they are multiplied. But if the man of genius represents a spiritual principle, his influence is not fixed but grows with the growth of life itself, and is limited only by the vitality of what he stands for. The real cause of literary and artistic weakness, insofar as it exists, I take to be chiefly the spiritual disorganization incident to a time of rather sudden transition. How this condition, and others closely associated with it, are unfavorable to great aesthetic production I shall try to point out under the four heads: confusion, commercialism, haste, and zeal for diffusion. With reference to the higher products of culture, not only the United States, but in some degree contemporary civilization in general, is a confused, a raw society, not as being democratic, but as being new. It is our whole newspaper and factory epoch that is crude, and scarcely more so in America than in England or Germany. The main difference in favor of European countries being that the present cannot so easily be separated from the conditions of an earlier culture. It is a general trait of the time that social types are disintegrated, old ones going to pieces and new ones not perfected, leaving the individual without adequate discipline, either in the old or in the new. Now, works of enduring greatness seem to depend, among other things, on a certain ripeness of historical conditions. No matter how gifted an individual may be, he is in no way apart from his time, but has to take that and make the best of it he can. The man of genius is, in one point of view, only a twig upon which a mature tendency bears its perfect fruit. In the new epoch, the vast things in process are as yet so unfinished that individual gifts are scarcely sufficient to bring anything to a classical completeness, so that our life remains somewhat inarticulate, our literature, and still more our plastic art, being inadequate exponents of what is most vital in the modern spirit. The psychological effect of confusion is a lack of mature culture groups. and of what they only can do for intellectual or aesthetic production. What this means may perhaps be made clearer by a comparison drawn from athletic sports. We find in our colleges that to produce a winning football team or distinguished performance in running or jumping, it is essential, first of all, to have a spirit of intense interest in these things, which shall arouse the ambition of those having natural gifts, support them in their training, and reward their success. Without this group spirit, no efficient organization, no high standard of achievement can exist, and a small institution that has this will easily surpass a large one that lacks it. And experience shows that it takes much time to perfect such a spirit and the organizations through which it is expressed. The group is likely to be more apparent or tangible in some arts than in others. It is generally quite evident in painting, sculpture, architecture, and music, where a regular development by the passage of inspiration from one artist to another can almost always be traced. In literature, the connections are less obvious, chiefly because this art is in its methods more disengaged from time and place, so that it is easier to draw inspiration from distant sources. It is also partly a matter of temperament, men of somewhat solitary imagination being able to form their group out of remote personalities, and so to be almost independent of time and place. Thus, Thoreau lived with the Greek and Hindu classics, with the Old English poets, and with the suggestions of nature. But even he owed much to contemporary influences, and the more he is studied, the less solitary he appears. Is not this the case also with Wordsworth, with Dante, with all men who are supposed to have stood alone? The most competent of all authorities on this question, Goethe, was a full believer in the dependence of genius on influences. People are always talking about originality, he says, but what do they mean? As soon as we are born, the world begins to work upon us, and this goes on to the end. And after all, what can we call our own except energy, strength, and will? If I could give an account of all that I owe to great predecessors and contemporaries, there would be but a small balance in my favor. He even held that men of genius are more dependent upon their environment than others, for being thinner-skinned, they are more suggestible, more perturbable, and peculiarly in need of the right sort of surroundings to keep their delicate machinery in fruitful action. Another reason why the rawness of the modern world is unfavorable to great production is that the ideals themselves which a great art should express share in the general incompleteness of things, and do not present themselves to the mind clearly defined and incarnate in vivid symbols. Perhaps a certain fragmentariness and pettiness in contemporary art and literature is due more to this cause than to any other, to the fact that the aspirations of the time, large enough certainly, are too much obscured in smoke to be clearly and steadily regarded. We may believe, for example, in democracy, but it can hardly be said that we see democracy as the Middle Ages, in their art, saw the Christian religion. From this point of view of groups and organization, it is easy to understand why the individualism of our epoch does not necessarily produce great individuals. Individuality may easily be aggressive and yet futile, because not based on the training afforded by well-organized types, like the fruitless valor of an isolated soldier. Mr. Brownell points out that the prevalence of this sort of individuality in our art and life is a point of contrast between us and the French. Paris, compared with New York, has the organic quality which results from variety of types as distinguished from variety of individuals. The same conditions underlie that comparative uniformity of American life, which wearies the visitor and implants in the native such a passion for Europe. When a populous society springs up rapidly from a few transplanted seeds, its structure, however vast, is necessarily somewhat simple and monotonous. 1,000 towns, 10,000 churches, 1,000,000 houses are built on the same models, and the people and the social institutions do not altogether escape a similar poverty of types. No doubt this is sometimes exaggerated, and America does present many picturesque variations, but only a reckless enthusiasm will equal them with those of Europe. How unspeakably inferior in exterior aspect and in many inner conditions of culture must any recent civilization be to that, let us say, of Italy, whose accumulated riches represent the deposit of several thousand years. Such deposits, however, belong to the past, And as regards contemporary accretions, the sameness of London or Rome is hardly less than that of Chicago. It is a matter of the epoch, more conspicuous here chiefly because it has had fuller sweep. A heavy fall of crude commercialism is rapidly obscuring the contours of history. In comparison with Europe, America has the advantages that come from being more completely in the newer current of things. It is nearer, perhaps, to the spirit of the coming order, and so perhaps more likely, in due time, to give it adequate utterance in art. Another benefit of being new is the attitude of confidence that it fosters. If America could hardly have sustained the assured mastery of Tennyson, neither, perhaps, could England an optimism like that of Emerson. In contrast to the latter, Carlyle, Ruskin, and Tolstoy, prophets of an older world, are shadowed by a feeling of the ascendancy and inertia of ancient and somewhat decadent institutions. They are afraid of them, and so are apt to be rather shrill in protest. An American, accustomed to see human nature have pretty much its own way, has seldom any serious mistrust of the outcome. Nearly all of our writers, as Emerson, Longfellow, Lowell, Whittier, Holmes, Thoreau, Whitman, even Hawthorne, have been of a cheerful and wholesome personality. On the other hand, an old civilization has from its mere antiquity a richness and complexity of spiritual life that cannot be transplanted to a new world. The immigrants bring with them the traditions of which they feel an immediate need, such as those necessary to found the state, the church, and the family. But even these lose something of their original flavor, while much of what is subtler and less evidently useful is left behind. We must remember, too, that the culture of the Old World is chiefly a class culture, and that the immigrants have mostly come from a class that had no great part in it. With this goes loss of the visible monuments of culture inherited from the past. Architecture, painting, sculpture, ancient universities, and the like. Burne-Jones, the English painter, speaking of the commercial city in which he spent his youth, says, "If there had been one cast from ancient Greek sculpture or one faithful copy of a great Italian picture, to be seen in Birmingham when I was a boy, I should have begun to paint 10 years before I did." Even the silent presence of great works in your town will produce an impression on those who see them, and the next generation will, without knowing how or why, find it easier to learn than this one does whose surroundings are so unlovely. Nor is American life favorable to the rapid crystallization of a new artistic culture. It is too transient and restless. Transatlantic migration is followed by internal movements from east to west and from city to country, while on top of these we have a continuous subversion of industrial relations. Another element of special confusion in our life is the headlong mixture of races, temperaments, and traditions that comes from the new immigration, from the eruption by millions of peoples from the south and east of the Old World. If they were wholly inferior, as we sometimes imagine, it would perhaps not matter so much. But the truth is that they contest every intellectual function with the older stock, and in the universities, for instance, are shortly found teaching our children their own history and literature. They assimilate, but always with a difference, and in the northern United States, formerly dominated by New England influences, a revolution from this cause is well underway. It is as if a kettle of broth were cooking quietly on the fire, when someone should come in and add suddenly a great pailful of raw meats, vegetables, and spices. A rich combination, possibly, but likely to require much boiling. That fine English sentiment that came down to us through the colonists more purely, perhaps, than to the English in the old country, is passing away as a distinct current, that is, lost in a flood of cosmopolitan life. Before us, no doubt, is a larger humanity, but behind is a cherished spirit that can hardly live again. And, like the boy who leaves home, we must turn our thoughts from an irrevocable past and go hopefully on to we know not what. In short, our world lacks maturity of culture organization. What we sometimes call, truly enough as regards its economic life, our complex civilization is simple to the point of poverty and spiritual structure. We have cast off much rubbish and decay and are preparing, we may reasonably hope, to produce an art and literature worthy of our vigor and aspiration. But in the past, certainly, we have hardly done so. Haste and the superficiality and strain which attend upon it are widely and insidiously destructive of good work in our day. No other condition of mind or of society, not ignorance, poverty, oppression, or hate, kills art as haste does. Almost any phase of life may be ennobled if there is only calm enough in which the brooding mind may do its perfect work upon it. But out of hurry, nothing noble ever did or can emerge. In art, human nature should come to a total, adequate expression. A spiritual tendency should be perfected and recorded in calmness and joy. But ours is, on the whole, a time of stress, of the habit of incomplete work. Its products are unlovely and unrestful, and such as the future will have no joy in. The pace is suited only to turn out mediocre goods on a vast scale. It is, to put the matter otherwise, a loud time. The newspapers, the advertising, the general insistence of suggestion have an effect of din, so that one feels that he must raise his voice to be heard, and the whispers of the gods are hard to catch. Men whose voices are naturally low and fine easily lose this trait in the world and begin to shout like the rest. That is to say, they exaggerate and repeat and advertise and caricature, saying too much in the hope that a little may be heard. Of course, in the long run, this is a fatal delusion. Nothing will really be listened to except that whose quiet truth makes it worth hearing. But it is one so rooted in the general state of things that few escape it. Even those who preserve the lower tone do so with an effort which is in itself disquieting. A strenuous state of mind is always partial and special, sacrificing scope to intensity, and more fitted for execution than insight. It is useful at times, but if habitual, cuts us off from that sea of subconscious spirit from which all original power flows. Henry James remarks that we have practically lost the faculty of attention, meaning, I suppose, that unstrenuous, brooding sort of attention required to produce or appreciate works of art. And as regards the prevalent type of business or professional mind, this seems quite true. It comes mainly from having too many things to think of, from the urgency and distraction of an epoch and a country in which the traditional structures that support the mind and save its energy have largely gone to pieces. The endeavor to supply by-will functions that in other conditions would be automatic creates a rush which imitation renders epidemic, and from which it is not easy to escape in order to mature one's powers in fruitful quiet. There is an immense spiritual economy in any settled state of society, sufficient so far as production is concerned to offset much that is stagnant or oppressive. The will is saved and concentrated, while freedom, as de Tocqueville noted, sometimes produces a small distressing motion, a sort of incessant jostling of men, which annoys and disturbs the mind without exciting or elevating it. The modern artist has too much choice. If he attempts to deal largely with life, his will is overworked at the expense of aesthetic synthesis. Freedom and opportunity are without limit, all cultures within his reach and splendid service awaiting performance. But the task of creating a glad whole seems beyond any ordinary measure of talent. The result in most cases, as has been said of architecture, is confusion of types, illiterate combinations, an evident breathlessness of effort and striving for effect, with the inevitable loss of repose, dignity, and style. A medieval cathedral or Greek temple was the culmination of a long social growth, a gradual, deliberate corporate achievement to which the individual talent added only the finishing touch. The modern architect has no doubt as much personal ability, but the demands upon it are excessive. It would seem that only a transcendent synthetic genius of the caliber of Dante could deal adequately with our scattered conditions. The cause of strain is radical and somewhat feverish change, not democracy as such. A large part of the people, particularly the farming class, are little affected by it, and there are indications that in America, where it has been greater than elsewhere, the worst is now over. By commercialism, in this connection, we may understand a preoccupation of the ability of the people with material production and with the trade and finance based upon it. This again is in part a trait of the period, in part a peculiarity of America, in its character as a new country with stumps to get out and material civilization to erect from the ground up. The result of it is that ability finds constant opportunity and incitement to take a commercial direction, and little to follow pure art or letters. A man likes to succeed in something, and if he is conscious of the capacity to make his way in business or professional life, he is indisposed to endure the poverty, uncertainty, and indifference which attend the pursuit of an artistic calling. Less prosperous societies owe something to that very lack of opportunity, which makes it less easy for artistic ability to take another direction. An even greater peril is the debasing of art by an uncultured market. There seem to be plenty of artists of every kind, but their standard of success is mostly low. The beginner too early gets commercial employment, in which he is not held up to any high ideal. This brings us back to the lack of a well-knit artistic tradition to educate both the artist and the public, the lack of a type, the non-existence, as Mr. Russell Sturgis says, of an artistic community with a mind of its own and a certain general agreement as to what a work of art ought to be. This lack involves the weakness of the criticism which is required to make the artist see himself as he ought to be. That criticism is nowhere in proportion to the need of it, says Henry James. Is the visiting observer's first and last impression, an impression so constant that it at times swallows up or elbows out every other. The antipathy between art and the commercial spirit, however, is often much overstated. As a matter of history, art and literature have flourished most conspicuously in prosperous commercial societies, such as Athens, Florence, Venice, the communes of the 13th and 14th centuries, the trading cities of Germany, the Dutch Republic, and the England of Elizabeth. Nothing does more than commerce to awaken intelligence, enterprise, and a free spirit, and these are favorable to ideal production. It is only the extreme one-sidedness of our civilization in this regard that is prejudicial. It is also true, and here we touch upon something pertaining more to the very nature of democracy than the matters so far mentioned, that the zeal for diffusion which springs from communication and sympathy has in it much that is not directly favorable to the finer sorts of production. Which is the better, fellowship or distinction? There is much to be said on both sides, but the finer spirits of our day lean toward the former, and find it more human and exhilarating to spread abroad the good things the world already has than to prosecute a lonesome search for new ones. I notice among the choicest people I know, those who seem to me most representative of the inner trend of democracy, a certain generous contempt for distinction, and a passion to cast their lives heartily on the general current. But the highest things are largely those which do not immediately yield fellowship or diffuse joy. Though making in the end for a general good, they are as private in their direct action as selfishness itself, from which they are not always easily distinguished. They involve intense self-consciousness. Probably men who follow the whispers of genius will always be more or less at odds with their fellows. Ours, then, is an age of diffusion. The best minds and hearts seek joy and self-forgetfulness in active service, as in another time they might seek it in solitary worship. God, as we often hear, being sought more through human fellowship and less by way of isolated self-consciousness than was the case a short time since. I need hardly particularize the educational and philanthropic zeal that, in one form or another, incites the better minds among our contemporaries and makes them feel guilty when they are not in some way exerting themselves to spread abroad material or spiritual goods. No one would wish to see this zeal diminished, and perhaps it makes in the long run for every kind of worthy achievement. But its immediate effect is often to multiply the commonplace, giving point to de Tocqueville's reflection that in aristocracies a few great pictures are produced, in democratic countries a vast number of insignificant ones. In a spiritual as well as a material sense, there is a tendency to fabricate cheap goods for an uncritical market. Men and gods are too extensive. Finally, all theories that aim to deduce from social conditions the limits of personal achievement must be received with much caution. It is the very nature of a virile sense of self to revolt from the usual and the expected and pursue a lonesome road. Of course, it must have support, but it may find this in literature and imaginative intercourse. So, in spite of everything, we have had in America men of signal distinction, such, for instance, as Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, and we shall no doubt have more. We need fear no dearth of inspiring issues, for if old ones disappear, energetic minds will always create new ones by making greater demands upon life. The very fact that our time has so largely cast off all sorts of structure is in one way favorable to enduring production, since it means that we have fallen back upon human nature, upon that which is permanent and essential, the adequate record of which is the chief agent in giving life to any product of the mind. By sentiment, I mean socialized feeling, feeling which has been raised by thought and intercourse out of its merely instinctive state and become properly human. It implies imagination, and the medium in which it chiefly lives is sympathetic contact with the minds of others. Thus, love is a sentiment while lust is not. Resentment is, but not rage. The fear of disgrace or ridicule, but not animal terror, and so on. Sentiment is the chief motive power of life, and as a rule lies deeper in our minds and is less subject to essential change than thought, from which, however, it is not to be too sharply separated. Two traits in the growth of sentiment are perhaps characteristic of modern life, both of which, as will appear, are closely bound up with the other psychological changes that have already been discussed. First, a trend toward diversification. Under the impulse of a growing diversity of suggestion and intercourse, many new varieties and shades of sentiment are developed. Like a stream which is distributed for irrigation, the general current of social feeling is drawn off into many small channels. Second, a trend toward humanism, meaning by this a wider reach and application of the sentiments that naturally prevail in the familiar intercourse of primary groups. Following a tendency evident in all phases of the social mind, these expand and organize themselves at the expense of sentiments that go with the more formal or oppressive structures of an earlier epoch. The diversification of sentiment seems to involve some degree of attenuation, or decline in volume, and also some growth of refinement. By the former, I mean that the constant and varied demands upon feeling which modern life makes, in contrast to the occasional but often severe demands of a more primitive society, give rise, very much as in the case of the irrigating stream, to the need and practice of more economy and regularity in the flow, so that animated moderation in feeling succeeds the alternations of apathy and explosion characteristic of a ruder condition. Thus, our emotional experience is made up of diverse, but for the most part rather mild excitements, so that the man most at home in our civilization, though more nimble in sentiment than the man of an earlier order, is perhaps somewhat inferior in depth. Something of the same difference can be seen between the city man and the farmer. While the latter is inferior in versatility and readiness of feeling, he has a greater store of it laid up, which is apt to give superior depth and momentum to such sentiment as he does cherish. Who has not experienced the long-minded faithfulness and kindness, or perhaps resentment, of country people, and contrasted them with the less stable feelings of those who live a more urbane life? In saying that life tends toward refinement, it is only a general trend that is asserted. We must admit that many phases of refined sentiment have been more perfectly felt and expressed in the past than they are now. But this is a matter of the maturity of special types of culture, rather than of general progress. Thus, the Italian Renaissance produced wonders of refinement in art, as in the painting, let us say, of Botticelli. But it was on the whole a bloody, harsh, and sensual time compared with ours. A time when assassination, torture, and rape were matters of everyday occurrence. So also there is a refinement of the sense of language in Shakespeare and his contemporaries which we can only admire, while their plays depict a rather gross state of feeling. A course of reading in English fiction, beginning with Chaucer and ending with James, Howells, and Mrs. Ward, would certainly leave the impression that our sensibilities had on the whole grown finer. And this is even more true of the common people than of the well-to-do class with which literature is chiefly occupied. The tendency to the diffusion of refinement being more marked than its increase in a favored order. The sharp contrast in manners and feelings between the gentleman, as formerly understood, and the peasant, artisan, and trading classes has partly disappeared. Differences in wealth and occupation no longer necessitate differences in real culture, the opportunities for which are coming to be open to all classes, and in America at least, the native-born farmer or handworker is not uncommonly, in essential qualities, a gentleman. The general fact is that the activities of life to which feeling responds have become more various and subtle and less crudely determined by animal conditions. Material variety and comfort is one phase of this. We become habituated to a comparatively delicate existence and so are trained to shun coarseness. Communication, by giving abundance and choice of social contacts, also acts to diversify and refine sentiment. The growth of order disaccustoms us to violence, and democracy tends to remove the degrading spectacle of personal or class oppression. This modern refinement has the advantage that, being a general rise in level rather than the achievement of a class or a nation, it is probably secure. It is not like the refinement of Greece, the somewhat precarious fruit of transient conditions, but a possession of the race in no more danger of dying out than the steam engine. To the trend toward humanism and the sentiments, such as justice, truth, kindness, and service, that go with it, I shall devote the rest of this chapter and the one that follows. The basis of all sentiment of this kind is the sense of community, or of sharing in a common social or spiritual whole, membership in which gives to all a kind of inner equality, no matter what their special parts may be. It is felt, however, that the differences among men should be functional and intrinsic, not arbitrary or accidental. The sense of justice is usually strong among the members of a sympathetic group. The basis for determining what is just being the perception of some purpose which everyone is to serve, each in his own way, so that he who rightly holds a higher place is the one who can function best for the common good. It does not hurt my self-respect or my allegiance to remain a common seaman while another becomes captain of the ship, provided I recognize that he is the fitter man for the place. And if the distribution of stations in society were evidently of this sort, there would be no serious protest against it. What makes trouble is the growth of an ideal of fair play, which the actual system of things does not satisfy. The widening of sympathy and the consciousness of larger unity have brought the hope and demand for a corresponding extension of justice. And all sorts of humanity, not to speak of the lower animals, profit by this wider sentiment. Classes seek to understand each other. The personality of women and children is recognized and fostered. There is some attempt to sympathize with alien nations and races, civilized or savage, and to help them to their just place in the common life of mankind. Our conception of international rights reflects the same view, and the American at least desires that his country should treat other countries as one just man treats another, and is proud when he can believe that she has done so. It is surely of some significance that in the most powerful of democracies, national selfishness, in the judgment of a competent European observer, is less cynical and obtrusive than in any of the great states of Europe. Truth is a kind of justice, and wherever there is identification of oneself with the life of the group, it is fostered, and lying tends to be felt as mean and impolitic. Serious falsehood among friends is, I believe, universally abhorred, by savages and children as well as by civilized adults. To lie to a friend is to hit him from behind, to trip him up in the dark, and so the moral sentiment of every group attempts to suppress falsehood among its members, however it may be encouraged as against outsiders. Wherefore, says St. Paul, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Our democratic system aims to be a larger organization of moral unity, and so far as it is so in the feeling of the individual, it fosters this open and downright attitude toward his fellows. In idea, and largely in fact, we are a commonwealth of which each one is a member by his will and intelligence, as well as by necessity, and with which, accordingly, the human sentiment of loyalty among those who are members, one of another, is naturally in force. The very disgust with which, in a matter like assessment for taxation, men contemplate the incompatibility that sometimes exists between truth and fairness, is a tribute to the prevailing sentiment of sincerity. An artificial system, that is, one which, however solid its hidden foundations, and of course all systems rest on fact of some sort, does not visibly flow from principles of truth and fairness, fails to arouse this loyalty of partnership. One may be devoted to it, but his devotion will be based rather on reverence for something above him than on a sense of participation, and will call for submission rather than for straightforward dealing. It would seem that lying and servility are natural in the attitude of a subject toward a master, that is, toward a superior but uncomprehending power, while truth is generated in sympathy. Tyranny may be said to make falsehood a virtue, and in contemporary Russia, for instance, stealth and evasion are the necessary and justifiable means of pursuing the aims of human nature. Another reason for the association of freedom with truth is that the former is a training in the sense of social cause and effect, the free play of human forces being a constant demonstration of the power of reality as against sham. The more men experiment intelligently with life, the more they come to believe in definite causation and the less in trickery. Freedom means continuous experiment, a constant testing of the individual and of all kinds of social ideas and arrangements. It tends then to a social realism. Her open eyes desire the truth. The best people I know are pervaded by the feeling that life is so real that it is not worthwhile to make believe. Knights of the unshielded heart, they desire nothing so much as to escape from all pretense and prudery and confront things as they really are, confident that they are not irremediably bad. I read in a current newspaper that brutal, unvarnished, careless frankness is the pose of the new type of girl. She has not been developed in a school of evasion. To pretend you gave $100 for a gown when you really gave 50 for it is a sorry jest for her and a waste of time. If she owns to the new gown she tells you its cost, the name of the inexpensive dressmaker who made it, and just where she economized in its price. There is a tribute to truth in the very cynicism and shamelessness with which flagitious politicians and financiers declare and defend their practices. Like Napoleon or Machiavelli, they have at least cast off superstition and are dealing with reality, though they apprehend it only in a low and partial aspect. If they lie, they do so deliberately, scientifically, with a view to producing a certain effect upon people whom they regard as fools. It only needs that this rational spirit should ally itself with higher sentiment and deeper insight in order that it should become a source of virtue. I will not here inquire minutely how far or in what sense honesty is the best policy, but it is safe to say that the more life is organized upon a basis of freedom and justice, the more truth there is in the proverb. When the general state of things is anarchical, as in the time of Machiavelli, rationalism may lead to the cynical use of falsehood as the tool suited to the material. Nor is it deniable that this is often the case at the present day. But modern democracy aims to organize justice, and insofar as it succeeds, it creates a medium in which truth tends to survive and falsehood to perish. We all wish to live in such a medium. There is nothing more grateful than the conviction that the order of things is sincere, is founded on reality of some sort. And in a good measure, the American, for instance, does have this conviction. It makes democracy a soft couch for the soul. One can let himself go and does not have to make believe. Pretense is no part of the system. Be your real self and you will find your right place. An artificial system must maintain itself by suppressing the free play of social forces and inculcating its own artificial ideas in place of those derived from experience. Free association, free speech, free thinking, insofar as they touch upon matters vital to authority, are and always have been put down under such systems. And this means that the whole mind of the people is emasculated, as the mind of Italy was by Spanish rule and religious reaction in the 17th and 18th centuries. Oriental mendacity is ascribed to the insecurity of life and property under arbitrary rule. But it is not merely life and property that are affected. The very idea of truth and reason in human affairs can hardly prevail under a system which affords no observation to corroborate it. The fact that in diplomacy, for instance, there is a growing belief that it pays to be simple and honest, I take to be a reflection of the fact that the international system, based more and more on intelligent public opinion, is gradually coming to be a medium in which truth is fit to live. Perhaps something of this hostility to truth will linger in all establishments, however they may be humanized. They all involve a kind of vested interest in certain ideas which is not favorable to entire frankness. It sometimes appears that one who would be quite honest and stand for human nature should avoid not only religious, political, and educational allegiance, but law, journalism, and all positions where one has to speak as part of an institution. As a rule, the great seers and thinkers have stood as much aside from institutions as the nature of the human mind permits. Still, another reason for the keener sense of truth in our day is the need to economize attention. In societies where life is dull, fiction, circumlocution, and elaborate forms of intercourse serve as a sort of pastime, and the first arouses no resentment unless some definite injury is attempted by it. Although the Chinese are upright in keeping their pecuniary engagements, we are told that mere truth is not valued by them and is not inculcated by their classic moralists. So in Italy, the people seem to think that a courteous and encouraging lie is kinder than the bare truth, as when a man will pretend to give you information when he knows nothing about the matter. A strenuous civilization like ours makes one intolerant of all this. It is not that we are always hurried, but we are so often made to feel the limitations of our attention that we dislike to waste it. Thought is life, and we wish to get the most reality for a given outlay of it that is to be had. We wish to come at once to the real thing, whether it be a business proposition or the most subtle theory. Another sentiment favored by the times is social courage and hopefulness, a disposition to push forward with confidence regarding the future both of the individual and of society at large. That this attitude is the prevalent one, in American democracy at least, nearly all observers are agreed. Let anyone, says Dr. Lyman Abbott, stand on one of our great highways and watch the countenances of the passers-by. The language written on most of them is that of eagerness, ambition, expectation, hope. There is something ruthless about this headlong optimism, which is apt to deny and neglect failure and despair, as certain religious sects of the day deny and neglect physical injury, but it answers its purpose of sustaining the combatants. It springs from a condition in which the individual, not supported in any one place by a rigid system, is impelled from childhood to trust himself to the common current of life, to make experiments, to acquire a habit of venture, and a working knowledge of social forces. The state of things instigates endeavor and, as a rule, rewards it sufficiently to keep up one's courage, while occasional failure at least takes away that vague dread of the unknown which is often worse than the reality. Life is natural and vivid, not the waxworks of an artificial order, and has that enlivening effect that comes from being thrown back upon human nature. A real pessimism, one which despairs of the general trend of things, is rare and without much influence, even the revolutionary sects maintaining that the changes they desire are in the line of a natural evolution. Discontent is affirmative and constructive rather than stagnant. It works out programs and hopefully agitates for their realization. There is a kind of piety and trust in God to be seen in the confidence with which small bodies of men anticipate the success of principles they believe to be right. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.